everybody, Aaron Blaise here, and I've got a really special treat for you guys today. It is Polar Bear Day, and as you guys know, I've just recently finished a brand new short film called Snow Bear about a lonely polar bear living in the Arctic, and he makes a snow bear for companionship. And it's we're getting it out there, and it's getting seen. And along the way, we have made friends with a wonderful organization. Some of you may already know, Polar Bears International. And I have the wonderful one and only Alyssa McCall with us today, who I'm going to let her talk about herself, but I want to just let you guys know we're going to do a little interview today, and you're going to see some artwork, and we're going to learn about polar bears, and it's really going to be a really cool time. So without further ado, I want to introduce Alyssa McCall. And I was wondering, Alyssa, to just start off, I wonder if you could talk about yourself and the organization and kind of how you fit in and that sort of thing.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Aaron. Hi everyone. I live up in Whitehorse in the Yukon right now. I've been working with polar bears since about 2010, so it's been quite a
Wow.
while. And some of my very first work was with moms and cubs, so I'm very excited to talk to you about them today. I just think this species is so incredible, and moms and cubs are the most incredible part of this species. So I've been really, really lucky throughout my research and my work to end up at Polar Bears International. We are a nonprofit organization, the only one in the world that's only focused on polar bears and ensuring their long-term conservation. And we're doing that through research. We do our own research, we fund other research, we do education, media, things like this. If people are
Yeah.
movies or TV shows, we want to be a part of it and making sure that polar bear story is being told. And then advocacy, so speaking up on behalf of polar bears and helping people understand how we can make a difference for them. So right now, my title is the Director of Conservation Outreach and Staff Scientist. Basically, that just means I'm in the education part and the science part, which is a really neat way to contribute to the organization and to polar bear conservation. I'm really just so happy to be here with you today and to celebrate International Polar Bear Day.
So, what is International Polar Bear Day and how did it come to be? What's it all about?
Right, so Polar Bears International founded International Polar Bear Day about 20 years ago, and we timed it to coincide with when moms and cubs are emerging from their den and heading out onto the ice, and really just to highlight this most vulnerable time in the most vulnerable polar bear's life. And we use it to, help spread awareness, to highlight our research, and to just further the protection of polar bears, especially moms and cubs.
Wonderful. That's amazing. That's great. How did you come to polar bears? How did it, how for you growing up, how is it that you ended up with working on polar bears?
Yeah, by accident, definitely. Growing up as a kid, I'm sure like many kids, if any are watching this, I just loved animals. I grew up in British Columbia in Canada and was surrounded by wildlife. We did have bears in our yard all the time, but I just loved all the things. And when I was maybe around 10 or 11 or something, I learned that being a wildlife biologist was a real job and that I could potentially get somehow paid to work with animals. So when I finished high school and went to university, I did an animal biology degree and I did a co-op program. So every summer I was working with animals in a different way. And actually at the time, I totally fell in love with mice. I worked with mice for years. I was handling deer mice and putting like little collars on them. I also did
That's awesome.
tracking backpacks on spadefoot toads and track them around. So I was really just into, yeah, helping animals. And long story short, my supervisor from the little animal work had gone to school with Andy DeRoche years prior, and Andy is a leading polar bear scientist. And anyway, helped put us in touch. And, I'd been a good student and the timing worked out with funding. And I ended up in Andy's lab unexpectedly in Edmonton, Alberta. And through that lab, I met Polar Bears International, and the whole kind of thing felt like a dream. It was a bit of luck, bit of hard work. And I never would have dreamed I would have been able to see a polar bear in real life, let alone actually be part of their story.
That's amazing. That's still here I've done this whole film about polar bears and I have yet to see a polar bear in the wild. And just like you, I'm so excited I know before I die, it's going to happen. So I want to do that myself. So polar bears, to me, when I think about polar bears and I think about the state of the world and, where we are, they're kind of the canary in the mine, right? Of the North, of the Arctic, of what's happening with our environment. I was wondering if you could speak on that and just a little bit about, um, you know, how global warming and all that sort of thing, how that's affecting not just the Arctic, but also polar bears in general.
Absolutely, yeah. Excuse me. So polar bears, one of the many ways in which they're so unique is that they are the only bear species that have all eight, the only bear that relies on the ocean for survival. And that's because they make their living on the frozen ocean, the Arctic sea ice. And it's an incredible, harsh, wild habitat. I mean, what kind of bear lives on ice? It's
Yeah.
crazy.
They're actually classified as a marine mammal, right?
Are exactly, yeah, they're the only marine bear. They're a marine mammal, which adds a whole other layer to their management, which is another conversation. They're so special in so many ways, but that specialness and uniqueness can make them extra vulnerable. Their strength also is their weakness in some ways. So, we know the world's warming. We've been burning too many fossil fuels, releasing too many emissions into the atmosphere. Earth now has too much heat trapped around it. We've got like this heat trapping blanket. Heat isn't escaping back to space like it used to, all these things. And that has a direct impact on ice. I mean, it's physics that
Absolutely.
warms up, ice melts. And for polar bears, what that means is simply a decline in habitat. And we see declining habitat in other species. When it's on land, we have a few more options. So for a terrestrial animal, we can plant more trees or put up fences or hire guards to protect areas. But when you have a species out on the ice, and we're losing that ice to warming temperatures, we can't just grow more of it or put up a fence. We really need to act on the core issue, which is, how humans are using our energy. So polar bears really have kind of accidentally become the symbol of climate change. They're a beautiful symbol and they're an important symbol. And one of my favorite things about polar bears is that everything we do for them, which means everything we do to protect Arctic sea ice is really good for humans too. It's good for all the things because it
Of
means
course.
we're acting on a cleaner planet and a more sustainable future for all of us and all generations of animals and people. So, yeah, polar bears really, they do need that habitat. They
Right.
need that sea ice to go hunt their prey seals, and without it, they'll be in trouble.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people, when people think of bears, they think of, yeah, bears, during the winter, they den up during the winter and they go to sleep. That's a polar bear time, right? That's when they need to get out there and on the ice. And so, yeah, the more you shrink that ice, obviously, it's less time out on out on their hunting grounds. Because during the summer, when the ice breaks up, they come on shore. They kind of fast, basically, don't they?
Yeah, polar bears are I can sometimes I call them like the kings of feasting and fasting, and
Yeah.
that they like the keto diet before it was cool or at go that far back. Yeah, so because polar bear's main prey is seal, they really have this high fat diet. So they're also known as the most carnivorous bear of all. But really, we like to call them lipovores because it's the fat they're after. So they eat tons of seal blubber, and that blubber helps them gain a lot of weight. And they can gain a lot of weight very quickly. But then in parts of the world, as you mentioned, they do come onto land in the summer. So in many areas of Canada, for example, including Hudson Bay, which is a very famous area for polar bears, those polar bears might spend months on land. And that's okay because they come onto land with hundreds of pounds of extra body weight. And so they can live off of that extra fat for quite a while. And that's normal. The problem becomes when they're losing this habitat and now we're forcing them on land for longer and longer and longer periods of time. And there is a
Yeah.
limit how long they can fast for, though they can do a good job. And they are eating things when they're on land. They
Yeah.
are bears, even though they're like this special bear. They're eating grass and berries and eggs and whatever they can. But for us, that would be like trying to last the whole summer on iceberg lettuce and jelly beans. Like it's not
Oh,
for us.
jelly beans. Come on. Yeah.
Yeah, I know. Jelly beans are maybe even a limit to how many jelly beans you can eat and not feel that good. And we know like too much protein for polar bears can hurt their kidneys, and too many carbohydrates doesn't do them any favors. They don't process that the same as brown bears. So they
Right.
need that fat, which they can only get out on the ice. And Increasingly in many areas, they have longer and longer time on land, as I said, and when that happens too, they're more likely to come into contact with people and get themselves in trouble. And we really want to see those bears out on the ice as much as we can.
I'm just out of curiosity, just out of my own reading and everything. I've read that brown bears and polar bears kind of split off about 100,000 years ago. Is that right? Somewhere in there?
Probably a little longer than that. It's funny. Their history together is interesting. So it's probably started before that, but there's been a bit of this happening.
Yeah, which it's interesting to me because that's so recent when you think about it, and even if it's half a million years ago, um, uh, what are some of the kind of the genetic kind of differences between the two? What are the ways that they've split off and one's become one of, how did polar bears become polar bears?
Yeah. Oh, it's such a good question. I like the genetics of polar bears have really taken off in the last 10 years. It's fascinating. So we think that polar bears maybe originally split off from brown bears that were in Alaska, and that this kind of group of brown bears learned that if they went out on the ice, oh, there's food out there. We can like grab a seal, and oh, we're more successful at that if our coat is whiter. Obviously, they're not having this thought process. It's the
Right.
genetic doing this. But over time, yeah, this kind of group evolved. So their fur is quite different. Polar bears, of course, look white. They have clear fur and they have hollow fur that helps trap warm air against their bodies. A big difference too is in the shape of their skull and their head and neck. So brown bears can be quite blocky, whereas polar bears, if you see their profile, they have these quite, I've heard it called like a Roman nose and like these long necks. And those necks and heads are much more suited for getting in and out of seal holes. When
Yeah.
seals breathe, and the polar bears can more easily get in and out. And more able for them also to lift their head out of water if they have to do a long swim. If you've got a big blocky neck, you're not gonna maybe
Yeah.
when you're swimming. Also, the feet, brown bears have these kind of long claws that are really good for digging and for terrestrial stuff. Polar bears have very thick, very sharp claws that are perfect for grabbing slippery seals. Um,
Wonderful.
so one like funny thing, so there's things we can't see too. Brown bears actually have a bit of a stronger bite because they have a crunchy diet. They're eating a
Yeah.
lot. And polar bears, they still, no one ever wants to get bit by a polar bear, but they don't bite quite as hard because their diet is squishy.
Right. There you go.
Yeah, so all these things, and then their digestive system too. There's some genetic differences where polar bears are they over 90% of the blubber they eat goes directly onto their body, which for humans be a nightmare. But for polar bears, where brown bears are much more effective at processing carbohydrates and proteins and getting energy out of that. So
Wow. So they are, that's the other thing too, just real quick and real basic fact that they're the largest land carnivore on Earth, right?
they are, yeah. So the biggest polar bears get bigger than the biggest brown bears. Yeah, they are the largest. And that's again that high fat, high calorie diet.
Wow,
Yeah.
that's amazing. So I wonder, maybe we can shift into some of the survival challenges of mothers and cubs. I've got a whole list of questions that I've set up ahead of time. Um, what are some of the biggest dangers a mother bear and her cubs face during their first year?
Oh, oh, that's such a good question. It's just I think it's so hard to keep little cubs alive out there. A big
Uh,
one is the habitat they rely on itself. Sea ice, even in its most stable form, it's still shifting a lot and it's breaking up and coming together. And moms are always having to navigate that ice, and they don't want to take those little cubs for swims, especially long swims. Those cubs don't have that body fat yet that's going to insulate them in the water. So navigating the ice is a big one. In areas of Hudson Bay where moms den on land, when they emerge from their den and they have to walk to the sea ice, they might walk for over 100 kilometers before they get to the ice. And there can be wolves
wow.
that, are out there. So she's got to avoid things on land. And then as soon as she gets on the ice, she's avoiding big male polar bears because they can also be a danger. And over time, as we are seeing ice melt, we're also just seeing it thin. So it's moving more than ever. It's more unpredictable. It's just a tough time out there. I'm always so in awe that any cubs make it to adulthood.
It's amazing. Yeah, that is incredible.
I spent some time on the sea ice. It's terrible. I don't know how they do it. They're absolutely incredible. Yeah.
Wow. Well, does, we've talked about climate change a little bit. I would assume that it affects the denning as well. Does climate change affect mother and cubs denning?
Yeah, absolutely. So polar bears are spread across the circumpolar north, and depending on where we look, they might den differently. So some females do den out on the ice. And so if we are seeing changes in the ice composition and poor ice years, or some years there's an unexpected rain event, that can really affect denning negatively. In other areas, Norway is one example. There's an island that used to be famous for polar bear denning, and the moms would go there, have their cubs, and you could see, I've heard it called like polar bear condos. You could see all these dens. The ice doesn't make it there on time. Moms can't even get to that island. So that island is no longer denned on. And then in areas like Hudson Bay, females will den in the permafrost, in the ground, the permanently frozen ground, and they'll reuse dens over time. But as the permafrost thaws, or yeah, thaws with warming temperatures, those dens can also become less stable and potentially more dangerous. So
Right.
different challenges in different areas of the Arctic.
Um, have you ever had to, this is kind of a tough question, but have you ever seen a mother bear have to make a tough decision, regarding her cubs and survival and that sort of thing?
In a way, yeah. So when we were working in Churchill, Manitoba, sometimes called the polar bear capital of the world, every October, November, there's a polar bear gathering there as the bears wait for the sea ice to come in. And as we head into November, the temperatures are dropping. The bears know the ice is coming. And so generally, we see adult males there and moms will start to bring their cubs in and they will be very attentive and kind of on the lookout and usually try to keep their cubs away.
Yeah,
But there are times, where they just can't protect their cubs, especially if they've got multiple cubs and they have to make a choice. Or if a male is coming at them and you can only protect one cub or get out of
right.
there with these cubs. So we have seen cubs get killed out there and we've seen the aftermath of that. And the moms have been able to protect one cub but not the other sort of thing. So it is always pretty devastating to see that and knowing that that's just part of nature. But that's part of their life, yeah, protecting their
Yeah.
baby, making those horrible choices they have to make.
Well, how many cubs does a mom typically have?
Yeah, typically 1 to 3. Three is less common than it used to be. It's never been common,
Right.
but we have seen three before for sure. So we're seeing more 1 and 2s. One single cubs tend to be a little bit bigger because they've got all of mom's attention and food, but 1 and 2 would be the most common we'd expect.
Wow. Um, what kind of research goes into studying polar bear mothers and the cubs? I mean, how do you safely observe them? What is it that you do, when you're watching them?
Yeah. Yeah, there's a few different ways we can do it. So there is a long-term research program through Environment and Climate Change Canada, federal government. They have been studying moms and cubs for decades. And it is a short period of time, about every March, near Churchill, where they do go out and actually handle moms and cubs. And this is important because they can really get a good sense of how healthy these families are. They can
Right.
weigh check all the things, little doctor checkup, see who mom is, tag these cubs so we know who they are moving forward. And that's one way to do it. We can also do it in a way where we're just observing. One example is Polar Bears International works with Norwegian Polar Institute and the San Diego Zoo Wildlife Alliance in Svalbard, Norway, which is a famous area for polar bears and has some wonderful denning. And we are able to go in right now. Our team is there right now. Put up some remote cameras that don't disturb the families at all. We get out of there. And then as the families emerge from the dens, we get video footage of the families and how they're interacting with
Wow.
who they are, how moms take care of their cubs, how cubs rely on their moms. And by building this kind of camera footage library over time, we can get a good sense of how things are changing or how many cubs are normal or, yeah, just how the families are doing. So, some different ways, whether hands on or hands off, that we can support these families, hopefully.
How long, as you talk about families, how long does a cub stay with its mother?
Just over 2 years and a little less than 2.5 years. So cubs would have been born. We give them all a birthday of January 1st just to make it easier for us, but they would have like December, early January. So, and they're going to be coming out of their dens in the next few weeks here, again, depending on where we're looking in the Arctic. And then they've kind of got 2 solid years with mom, and then just a little bit more until the spring of when they're in their third year of age. So maybe we can say 2.3 years old. And that spring, mom is going to be ready for a new litter of babies or to try again, and she'll wean her cubs away. And from that age, when they're just under 2.5 to 5 years old, that's the sub-adult. Those are like the teenager years for polar bear. They got to figure some stuff out. And
Yeah, I was gonna say that's such a bummer of a time for the cub, right? And they got to get out there and figure it out. I mean, I'm sure you've seen, I'm sure that it's this got to be so traumatic for them for, their mother that's taken care of them for so long to then chase them off and they got to kind of do things on their own. Do you see a lot of cubs struggle with that?
yeah, it is probably, when cubs are little, they're so vulnerable, but they have their mom. It's really, these sub-adult years are highly critical. It's where you kind of make or break being a polar bear. I think these are the ones that they're not fully grown. They're not fully, informed yet. Their brain
Yeah.
is they don't know all the things, and they're more likely to get in trouble with people as well. It's a hard time to be these kind of teenager bears. So yeah, we do see them struggle. If they can make it to five, make it to adulthood, they've got a pretty good chance of having a good polar bear life.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
speaking of that, then, I mean, it's obviously when the mother sends them off, they got to be out on their own. And their primary diet is seals, and that's such a specialized way of hunting. And there's got to be there's so much learning that's involved with that. How does that happen?
Oh, it's such a good question. And these are a lot of things we wish we knew a bit more about. So much of the polar bear life is so far removed from humans. We still have a lot of questions, but we know polar bears just absorb everything they can from their moms as much as they can. She's really got to teach them everything about hunting in just a couple short years. There's some, we've heard some stories, maybe if there's cubs that are together, they're like born together, maybe they'll stay together for a little while, help
Yeah.
each other. We're doing, there's a few more studies looking at scavenging now. Like maybe some of these young bears kind of sneakily follow some adult bears out on the ice and will kind of eat their leftovers a little bit sometimes. Spring is really big because that's when the seals are pupping. And so you have all these naive little seal pups, basically
Oh,
vegetables. And so that's the best time of year for polar bear, easy food. And so hoping that these young bears especially get to vacuum up as many,
yeah, little hors d'oeuvres, right? Yeah.
just like eat as much as you can, gain that weight to get you through.
Yeah.
So they, have to strategize as best they can to get the food that they need.
Yeah, I was going to say, considering that, so much of their life is dependent upon learned behavior, right? They've got to be incredibly intelligent on the kind of the animal spectrum, right? I would imagine that their intelligence is pretty high up there.
Yeah, it's hard to measure for sure, but we definitely consider them one of the most intelligent animals. Even if you talk to, zookeepers that have taken care of polar bears, they're so smart and clever
Yeah.
and funny. And and I mean, and even in the field, in our research, they they teach us lessons all the time. We think we've got some really figured out, oh, this camera's gonna work great, or this electric fence is solid, and they're just learning it right away. And they're so curious, and that's one of I think their best strengths. It's their curiosity out there on the sea ice that has allowed them to live how they do, because any little thing that moves or is a little different, they're gonna go check it out, like, oh, what does that mean? Or how can I figure this out? So it gets them into trouble, but it also, gets them where they are. They're so
Yeah.
smart. Yeah.
Yeah, because that kind of leads me to, obviously there's got to be a lot of surprising things that you can read a lot of stuff in the books and you can get classroom smart about anything, but it's not until you get out there and actually observe that you're really going to see some stuff that just doesn't happen unless you're observing it. Is there anything that you've seen that's really surprised you?
I think one of the neatest things is the relationships they seem to have. And I should say, we don't know if these relationships persist on the sea ice. It might be when they get out on the sea ice, they're like, hey, your competition, get away from me.
Right.
Again, so much to learn. But when we are in Churchill and we're watching these big gatherings of polar bears and they're bored and they're stuck together for like a month or more on end, we see these, dare I say, friendships forming between some bears sometimes that tend to hang out together for weeks on end and play and sleep together. And these can be two, grown adult males that are doing this. It's not a mom and cub necessarily. And so
Yeah.
we know they have this kind of secret life out there on the sea ice, and it's probably much richer than we know. And I think that's so fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, some of the, and I know you know all about this, but some of the most interesting video I've seen in the past is just the cross species kind of stuff where, polar bears in Churchill sitting with dogs and playing with dogs and stuff. Can you speak on that a little bit?
Yeah, the dog stuff's interesting. There's definitely some food involved in that one. But if the polar bears, especially if they're full, like they're
Yeah,
not, I think a myth about them is like they're the biggest predator in the world and they're this man eater and
yeah,
they are a predator, they are dangerous, but especially if their tummy's full, they are very curious and yeah, funny. And we have seen them play with dogs. We have seen them interact with other species where they're not just trying to eat everything all the time.
right, right.
Oh, hey, what's that going on? I've seen a wolverine run up to a polar bear and spook it, and the polar bear was like, "Oh my goodness, what are you doing?" It wasn't like, "Hey, whacking it or anything." It was like, "Oh my goodness, you're being rude."
Yeah.
So they definitely have this like other layer of um yeah, interactions they're willing to have, or this intelligence that is like, okay, I'm gonna figure this out. I'm not just gonna eat you right away.
Yeah, that's cool. I mean, because everybody thinks of them as this big, crazy, scary predator, that mindless kind of thing. But I think that's really cool. You mentioned wolves earlier. There's so many other big Arctic animals. There's caribou, there's muskox, there's wolves, and the wolverines, like you said. How often do they cross paths? I mean, does a polar bear ever hunt a muskox, for instance? I know a muskox is terrestrial. I mean, do you see much interaction in that sort of thing? Or caribou even, or reindeer?
Yeah, yeah. Right. Yeah. I was going to say reindeer is probably our best example. So, again, when a polar bear is hungry, anything's on the table, especially if they've been stuck on land. It's a lot of energy for a polar bear to chase something down on land, and they can
True.
overshoot quickly. And if they're not just getting only fat back, it's not always a great trade. But we are seeing increasingly in Svalbard in Norway, where I mentioned. So in Svalbard, they have these little reindeer and they are seeing more often in Svalbard that a polar bear will try to run one of those down or hunt those. So it's not going to, the reindeer aren't going to become like a staple of their diet, but they are catchable and fattier than you might think. And so they might help a little bit hold a polar bear over. So that is something we're seeing happen. And I have seen a polar bear eating a caribou. I don't know whether that polar bear killed that caribou or was scavenging, but they are open to possibilities when their tummy is rumbling. That is
Yeah,
for
I was wondering. Yeah, I would assume that they'll take anything like winter kill or scavenger or whatever, anything that comes along. That's interesting. What role do organizations like Polar Bears International, what do they play in protecting the mother bears and their cubs specifically? Because I know like you can go on the website and you can track individual bears and I know there's a lot of mothers and cubs that get tracked and I was wondering how that all works.
Yeah. There's a few different ways. I think with our status as a nonprofit, we have a lot of flexibility and we work with all sorts of amazing partners. And by combining different types of partnerships, we can get so much done. So, yeah, we do have the Polar Bears International Bear Tracker that we work with the University of Alberta and Environment Climate Change Canada, where we can give them some funding and support in other ways. And then they let us share some of these data points out so people can track the bears. It's like this mutually beneficial relationship. So we're really able to kind of amplify this polar bear story. And if there's good research being done, whether by us or somebody else, we want everyone to know about it and to share
Yeah.
that. talking more about polar bears and helping people understand them. We hope that we can help them love the polar bear as much as we do. And by working with, governments, other nonprofits, with some zoos, with other research institutions, communities, uh, people, individuals, there's all sorts of, power we can have by combining different types of influence and a lot of things we can accomplish. So if we can't directly write policy because we're not a government, we hope we can influence policy or give the best data to the policymakers and make
Right.
the polar bears, and for especially for moms and cubs, like, hey, this is what we learned about moms and cubs, this is how we learned it, here's the data so you can see, this is what we hope you can do for polar bears in the future, and please keep us in mind while you're coming up with your policy decisions, sort of thing. So hopefully we can make,
Yeah.
yeah, have some good influence.
I want, obviously polar bears kind of circumnavigate the entire Arctic region, right? And I, I'm assuming there's more polar bears in some regions than there are in others. And that would lead me to think that there's probably some populations that are probably more threatened than others. I was wondering if you could speak on that. Where are some of the more threatened populations of polar bears and what's happening with them?
Yeah. So we have 20 populations of polar bears spread across the Arctic, and that's split up amongst Canada, United States, Russia, Greenland, and Norway. Canada has two-thirds of the world's polar bears. And yeah, depending on where you look, there's different types of sea ice. There's different rates of warming. There's different rates of pollution and shipping and human interference. So these 20 populations do face different challenges for sure. Some of the most at-risk populations are the ones where the sea ice is changing really quickly, and that includes the southern Beaufort Sea off the coast of Alaska, and then that Hudson Bay area that I've mentioned a couple of times, particularly the western and southern Hudson Bay populations, which are some of the most southern polar bears in the world. Those polar bears are losing sea ice more quickly than others. They are on land now for about a month longer than their grandparents were. One interesting thing, though, after some genetic work that was recently done, there's some digging into the genetics and how adaptable polar bears are. Like, can they be resilient to climate change? We know ultimately polar bears need sea ice to be a polar bear. That's
Right.
not going to, but it does look like, Hudson Bay polar bears, they do have a bit of resiliency because they are used to times of fasting and they have that kind of built into them. So they, again, they have a limit, but still have time to protect them, even though they are most at risk. Polar bears that are up in the higher Arctic, they will probably have sea ice for longer. So the high Canadian Arctic, we think if there's going to be a last area of polar bears, that will be where it is. But they do have a bit less resiliency because they don't deal with these changes that other polar bears do. So if they are hit with changes, it might be a lot for them, whereas other
Right.
polar bears have a bit of flexibility. And the Svalbard bears, which I've mentioned a couple times, they are seeing a huge rate. They have the fastest warming there than anywhere. But those polar bears are still doing pretty okay because they also have some resiliency. And we see different, we call it ecotypes there. They have different strategies that the polar bears take. Some can hang out closer to land and hunt reindeer and make use of that, whereas others will follow the ice, and they have different strategies to figure it out. So right now, most vulnerable are kind of the southern Canadian ones and a bit of Alaska, but they all kind of
Yeah.
have challenges they're facing.
This
Mhm.
might be a dumb question, but I always think of polar bears as being, fairly nomadic. They get out there and they're wandering and they're finding whatever they can find and wherever their nose leads them. You talk about these isolated, well, not maybe they're not isolated, but these different populations of polar bears. And when sea ice freezes over, obviously you can go from here to there. Is there anything, do you ever see polar bears kind of migrate from one area to another? Does a Hudson Bay polar bear that's born in Hudson Bay stay in Hudson Bay, or have you ever seen anybody kind of move around?
It is pretty rare for them to make big movements. It has happened before, for sure, based on our tracking data. So
Hmm.
probably happens a bit more often than we know about, but it is pretty rare. Polar bears have what we call site fidelity, which means that they generally come back to areas where they were born. So again, Hudson Bay polar bears, we know they're born on land, for example, in Wapas National Park in Manitoba. And yeah, the ice freezes up. They can go all over Hudson Bay and they will mix with Southern Hudson Bay and Fox Basin bears. And that's good for the genetics that there's some mixing out there.
Right.
And when the ice melts, they're coming back to the same area every year. And researchers will capture polar bears, the same polar bear in nearly the same spot quite often. We know where they were born and they'll come back. Females will use the same denning area where they were born and they'll come back again and again. And we see that across the north. There's quite a bit of coming back to the area you know best. So
Yeah.
they will go out and mix, and there's different levels of that. But yeah, they might be a little less migratory and nomadic than you might think, big
That's
picture.
interesting. So, one of the basic question I kind of skipped over is, a polar bear, its longevity. How long typically does a bear make it?
It's different for males and females. So females will live into their mid or late 20s, pretty reasonably. Males are a little more like their late teens, early 20s generally, and that's because of mating season is just brutal.
Yeah.
The really just take a lot out of each other when they're fighting for mates. So they get pretty injured. They're not going to live quite as long. But, in a zoo setting, if a polar bear is quite pampered, they can live longer. And so the oldest polar bear we know of was Debbie, and she lived in the Assiniboine Park Zoo in Winnipeg, Manitoba, until she was 42 years old. So that's the record.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. So, yeah, so, 20 years in the same area, right? Other than they really don't move around too much. That's interesting. We were talking about mothers and cubs. I wanted to focus on that a little bit because, that's the image that I'm creating. How does a mother prepare? I mean, it's really the mothers are the only ones that den, right? And so how does she prepare for having her cubs?
Yeah, I've heard someone call it fat pajamas before, where really first, she needs to gain hundreds of pounds of weight. So, springtime comes, she has some hormonal shifts. She releases a pheromone, smelly footprint smell, so males can track her across the sea ice with her stinky feet. And she will gorge herself on food, and her body allows her to retain a ton of that weight. So if you ever see a truly obese polar bear, chances are it's a pregnant female. So that's step number one, because if she's not fat enough, she will not retain that pregnancy. And one neat thing about polar bear females too is that they'll mate, but they're not technically pregnant yet, which is one of the few cases on Earth where that's true. So they have something called delayed implantation. So she'll mate, she's got to gain a ton of weight, she's got to make it through the summer, and then in the fall, only if she's at the threshold she needs to be, which seems to be the lowest, is about 420 pounds, then that zygote will implant and now she's pregnant in the fall. So months later,
Gotcha.
only if she's fat enough. And then, yeah, she will enter her den, whether she makes it herself or reuses a den, depending on where she is in the world. And then she's just going to chill. She's got to rest. She's got to save her energy. She has a long road ahead, so she needs to relax for months. And then after a couple months in her den, she'll give birth and she'll be nursing her cubs. And her milk is the fattiest milk of any animal we find on land. It's over 30% fat, which is like us drinking whipping cream. And she'll give birth to these like tiny little babies that would be in the palm of your hands. They're, just over a pound or so. But in just a couple of months after drinking their mom's milk, they'll grow to, over 20 pounds in just a few months. And if you can imagine like 20 times growth rate for human children, just be terrifying, be like in
Right.
few months, but for polar bears, that's what you need. So the cubs grow really quickly. She's going to be taking care of them as best as she can. They're moving a bit in the den, but they don't have a lot of space. And when she's ready, and we don't yet know, is that like a light cue? Is it when her cubs are strong enough? Is it a smell thing? We're not sure. She'll break out of the den and she'll give her cubs usually at least a day or up to a week to explore and to exercise and to use their legs and to figure out what they are and what they're doing. And then she'll take them out to the ice and start hunting. And if you add all that time up together for that female from when she came, made it in the spring and then came back onto land, from that time to when she gets back on the ice, it's about
Yeah.
8 of fasting. And
Wow.
like it's I think one of the longest mammal fasts anyway we know of. It is completely wild that they can go that long. And meanwhile, giving birth and nursing, I mean, it's nuts. So she'll lose all the weight she gained. So she needs to get out there and eat. And mostly, or one of the, I should say, one of the reasons that she comes out when she does is to be timed with that seal pupping time. So there's hopefully lots of easier food to get and
Yeah.
give.
So, are the babies, are the young, are they able to? I'm obviously they're nursing for a little while when they come out. Are they able to eat anything other than their mother's milk when they emerge?
Yeah, yeah. So they will basically, as soon as mom hunts something, they'll start licking things, and I don't
Yeah.
know, oh, try a big hunk of seal blubber right away. They might, but they're definitely licking and getting in there, and seeing what mom's all about, and then from there, just figuring this whole thing out. And they will continue to nurse until she kicks them out when they're, just over 2 years old, but they will nurse less and less over time, and her milk will actually change composition over time. So it starts super, super fatty, and over time will become less fatty to kind of protect her energy, but also give her cubs some sustenance as well.
Interesting. So, Alyssa, here's a crazy question. Just how darn cute are polar bear cubs?
They're too darn cute.
They really are.
Really are.
They've got all those little baby proportions and everything, the big heads and everything. I love it.
Right? And they look so fuzzy. And I think maybe part of their cuteness also comes from this like juxtaposition between their very powerful mother and again this harsh, crazy environment. You just have this cute little like fluff ball thing just walking along, and it just adds to it that they're living in this wild, wild habitat that humans could hardly stomach to, go out
Yeah.
there. Little polar bear cub is that's their world, and
Yeah,
that's
I remember the first time that I saw a polar bear cub, as when I was younger, and they don't even look real because they don't have the definition. They just look like this round white little ball of fluff with two dark eyes and a little dark nose, and that's it. It looks like a little stuffed toy. It's really
yeah,
interesting. Yeah,
exist. I don't, they're so cute. They're so sweet. And to grow up and be what they will be is mind-blowing.
it really is. Yeah, so a lot of people think bears hibernate. They don't really hibernate. They kind of go into this other stasis. But do polar bear mothers, do they actually go into that different state, or are they just kind of hold up for a while? Or does their system slow down and that sort of thing?
It does seem like their system slows down a little bit. They're not like defecating as much as you might think. They don't have to be drinking water. Their respiration is a little slower. From what we know, again, it's quite hard to study. Yeah, they are, their body is definitely like, okay, it is time to conserve energy.
Yeah. You mean you don't crawl in the den and check them out? Come on. Yeah. Well, that's cool. Yeah, yeah. I just find it so fascinating that, yeah, 8 months. That's crazy. Um, so what percentage of body weight then are they losing over that period?
Oh gosh, good question. That it's a good chunk. I mean, so they'll go into the den. Often they're like around 600 pounds, and they might come out closer to 400 or 300. I mean, they could easily a quarter. It could be half. I would have to look
Wow.
that when but they're losing a lot. They're giving
Yeah, I need to get on that regimen. Right.
posting and posting like they're totally in vogue with the current diet trends. So yeah, it's amazing what they can do. Truly amazing.
Yeah, speaking of mothers and cubs and teaching and everything else, we always think of them as, they have to teach their cubs, what to do and how to do it and all that sort of thing. Do you ever see mothers correct their cubs or discipline their cubs or anything like that?
Yeah, it is. They do have some vocalizations, and again, something we don't know a ton about. We've got a bit of recording, and
Yeah.
it's hard for us to understand what they mean, but we've seen it before around like where we're watching polar bears, especially if like there's males around or even another family around and the cubs are a little too interested. Mom will kind of like chomp, and there's a bit of like a low growl grunt, and cubs know what's up. They gotta listen to their mom. So it does mean a lot. And yeah, you can see, especially sometimes if a mom has two cubs, and you can see like there's a well-behaved one and there's one that's not listening very well. often that one is the male cub, not always, but this just kind of seems to be how it goes sometimes. So, but yeah, mom will get frustrated for sure. But the older the cubs get, the more likely they are, yeah, to kind of push boundaries a little bit. And that's normal. I mean, that's with humans too, right? So, but when they're
Right.
really, it is pure survival to listen to everything mom is saying and watch everything mom does. And we will see cubs mimic their mothers like almost exactly. Like even if mom were to stop with a foot up, the cub would stop the exact same way.
Wow.
Some get really, really, they're focused on mom and that's in their best interest. And then as they get older, they're gonna see how much they can push and that's, I mean, healthy to an extent.
Yeah, that's great. Are there, I know we can wrap this up soon, but I'm just curious, do they learn like social cues and things like that from their mother?
Oh, that's an excellent question. I mean, they must to some extent. Polar bears are so interesting socially in that, again, out on the sea ice, we don't think they interact a lot. They might have some. And then we see these other bears interacting in the fall where they're all stuck together. Moms that have cubs tend to avoid almost all other bears, including other moms with cubs. So I'm not sure how much they would see their mom socialize or get that.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
might be some like kind of built-in, yeah, there's just some built-in instinct there, I think, maybe with how to interact with other bears
Or
potentially.
just stay away. Yeah.
Yeah, mom isn't having many ladies' nights out there on the sea ice, so I'm not too sure how much the Cubs get to see of that. It's a great question.
But so as we wrap this up and I was wondering, there's going to be a lot of people watching this. What advice can you give people? What can people do to help and to be more involved to um, make your job better and make polar bears' lives better? How can people contribute?
Yeah, I love that question. I mean, to protect polar bears long term, ultimately we need a switching to cleaner energies. But in the meantime, people, can continue to vote at any level of government, voting for leaders who just care about the environment and care about climate or just care about your future. Like that's a huge thing. And just using your voice and platform in any form that looks like. So even if it's just with your friends, colleagues, family, and I know that's easier said than done. Like talk to your friends. It's not quite always that easy, but when you can, it doesn't always have to be, it's not, it doesn't have to be political or anything. You just talk, hey, polar bears are so cool. Did you watch this thing? Man, they're just beautiful. I hope they stick around. Just spreading your love can do so much. And it can be as simple as that, truly. Just talking about things that are important to you and that you want to keep around and that you want to keep around for your kids. I think that's, a great place to start with everything else. So yeah,
Well,
and at our website and watch the movie, those things are great.
so where should people go online as far as checking out more about Polar Bears International and being able to help?
Yeah, our website has a lot of great information and very cute pictures. So
Mhm.
you can check out polarbearsinternational.org for all sorts of great information. And specifically, we actually have a toolkit for people. You can check out all these different ways that you can get involved and a take action page, which is kind of new. And you can even filter kind of, are you over 18, under 18, and all these different ways you can get involved depending on your ability and interest and sphere of influence. So yeah, if you just check that page out for the day, we'd be pretty happy and thank you for doing that.
Well, Alyssa, I really, really appreciate you taking the time. I know you're fighting a cold, so talking for almost an hour has got to be a pain in the butt. So thank you so much. We've really enjoyed this, and I hope everyone listening today has learned a little bit. And go and check out Polar Bears International. Check out their website and do what you can. Donate, track the bears, be involved. It's a wonderful cause. We've really enjoyed being involved with you guys, and I just want to thank you so much for kind of embracing us and doing all of this with us. And I'm hoping we can do more like this in the future too. But I want to just thank you so much, Alyssa, for taking. I know you're busy, and so taking the time today really means a lot to us. Thank you so much.
Oh, well, thank you so much for your idea and for working with us and for letting us be involved. It's been a wonderful project. We're just so thrilled to be a part of this with you. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you so much, everybody. Thanks for tuning in. And like I said, this is an image that I've been creating over the last couple of days or so, and we're going to make this available at creatureartteacher.com. And every purchase that is made, all 100% of the proceeds are going to go towards PBI and saving polar bears. So pull out your pocketbook, help us out, and we really appreciate it. Thanks a lot, you guys. And like I always say, go on out there, put some beauty back into the world, and I'll talk to you later. Bye. Hey, thanks for watching. If you want to learn more about Polar Bears International, scan the QR code on the left of your screen or click the link in the description. If you want to order a signed print of this image with 100% of the profit supporting PBI, then scan the QR code on the right of your screen or click the link below. Thanks a lot.